Okay, I'm sure we've got a few more people coming, but we should get started in part because I do need to end this like right at 11, if not a little sooner, because Laura Burns is sick. Anita and I got recruited to teach 4th grade Sunday school. Afterwards. So, okay, let's pray. There should be if you have the handout, there should be a prayer that we can pray it together. O Lord and Master of my life, give me now the spirit of sloth, vain curiosity, lust for power, and idle talk. But give to me, thy servant, a spirit of soberness, humility, patience, and love. O Lord of King, grant me to see my own faults, and not to condemn my brothers and sisters. For blessed art thou to the age of ages. Amen. O God, cleanse me from sins. Okay, so it's obviously Holy Week. We just celebrated Palm Sunday, or you will celebrate Palm Sunday if you're going to the 11 o'clock service. There are lots of things we could talk about for this week in the Bible, obviously. I thought we would focus on the Lord's Supper, or like the evening that Jesus has a meal with his disciples, in part because there's a lot going on here. And I think it's there's some things we can cover here. So I want to begin by looking at a Bible verse from 1 Corinthians. This is written by Paul, and he says, in the middle of this book, he says, "For our Paschal Lamb, the Messiah, or the Christ," those two words mean the same thing, "has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast." Paul takes this Old Testament reference to the Passover meal, which Jews observe every year, right? It's this year, it's on April 15th. What's going to happen for us on April 15th? Not taxes this year, after April 18th this year. But what is happening this week on April 15th? It's Good Friday, actually. Good Friday, right? So this is the day that the Passover meal would happen, and that the lamb is sacrificed. So Paul takes this Old Testament reference and applies it to Jesus, right? He does this is because Jesus does it, right? So the last supper that happens on Maundy Thursday, Jesus and his disciples are celebrating a Passover meal. They're being good Jews. What's happening? Passover is happening. They're kind of doing it on their own, which is a little different, right? But Jesus changes it all. That's what we're going to look at. He takes the Passover meal and says, we're not going to focus on the Exodus from Egypt and the lamb and all those sorts of things. We're going to talk about me, he says. He makes the Passover meal about himself. He transforms it. He reconfigures it. So he does this. He takes this Old Testament practice from the most important event in the Jewish Bible, right, in their religious life, the Exodus, and says there's going to be a new Exodus. And if there's going to be a new Exodus, we need a new Passover. That's what's happening right now. He makes it all about him, right? So he comes to identify all of these things about him, right? So rather than talking about the lamb, he talks about himself. He identifies the bread and the wine with his own body and blood, right? So we're going to walk our way through this. There's a handout there if you guys want it. So if we, just for sake of time and space, I'm not going to read all of Exodus chapter 12. It's a very long chapter. I couldn't even fit it on a page. But Exodus 12 is where we find the instructions for the Passover. So remember what's going to happen? This is the 10th plague. The angel of death is going to come and kill the firstborn sons. Firstborn son, right? Right, and so what are the Israelites commanded to do? They're commanded to basically sacrifice a sheep, and there are rules here of what has to happen, right? So they get the rules there, but of course this is written long after the fact, right? It's not written at that time, it's written down afterwards. And really what it is a liturgy, for this is how we're going to observe this everywhere, because they're commanded to do this all the time. The command is, you will keep this observance of Passover in perpetuity, forever. Right? You do this every year, right? And so this is what why they're doing it, to remember what God did for them by rescuing them from Egypt, right? From the slavery, right? And the sacrifice of the lamb is part of that remembrance, right? They got to put the blood on their doorposts, all these kinds of things. So if we go to Exodus 12, which I'm going to quickly go through this, there are at least 5 steps you need to do this properly. The first step is you have to choose an unblemished male lamb. It needs to be perfect, right? I got one hand up for you guys, I think, to the last one. Perfect lamb. So it can't have defects, right? Can't, like, say, if you're a shepherd, you can't pick the worst one and sacrifice that one. You're actually supposed to pick the best one. Right?
Why a male?
That was what they were told. Probably because it's a male, a son that's going to die if you don't. Okay. Right? But they're told to do it, it has to be a male. And there's probably some elements of a male lamb is what you would eat, whereas you'd probably keep your female lamb for milk. Female sheep for milk, these sorts of things. They don't have a lot of cows at this point. So this is what they're commanded to do. And again, the idea of why it has to be perfect is this is a symbol for it being sinless, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is you have to sacrifice the lamb. Now, there's a couple of things here that are happening, right? So in ancient Israel, way back, King David times, these kinds of things, right? By this time, we've got a priesthood, right? Because the story we give of the Old Testament is they go out from Egypt, they go to Mount Sinai, there's a golden calf. This causes huge, big problems. One of the consequences of that is a certain tribe, the tribe of Levi, is made priests. So by Jesus' time, only priests can do a sacrifice. They have to do it in the temple. But earlier, every male head of household could serve as a priest. So you'd have a Passover meal. The dad would basically do all the priestly stuff in your home, right? But by Jesus' time, this has changed. All this is happening in the temple, right? So you'd have to buy a sheep, take it to the temple. It would have to be slaughtered. You have to do all the kosher stuff. All the blood has to be drained out. You'd sacrifice it on the altar. Then you take it home and eat it. Right? It's kind of a hard thing. So it's lots of steps involved, right? Earlier, you would spread the blood of the lamb on the doorpost of the house, because this is what they did in the original Exodus, right? By Jesus' time, they aren't doing this, because everything's happening at the temple. You're not taking the blood home with you. It's a mess anyway, right? So they actually changed the practice, right? Then you have to go home and eat it. This is actually one of the most important steps. We're told 5 times in the Exodus account you have to eat the lamb. So if you were in the original Exodus and you really didn't like the lamb and your family decided we're not going to eat it, the hint is you would wake up and your firstborn son would be dead. Right? You got to eat it. Right? It's part of the sacrifice. Right? And it's a sacrifice of thanksgiving. It's a Thanksgiving meal. You're giving God thanks for what God has done. Right? By the way, some churches call the Lord's Supper the Eucharist. The word Eucharist simply means thanksgiving. Right? That's the whole idea. Right? Again, it shows us the connection here between the Lord's Supper and the Passover meal. Right? And this meal was for insiders. So if there were non-Israelites living in Israel at the time, they were not supposed to participate in this meal unless they converted. It's for insiders. You don't share this with everybody. It's the ritual for people who are part of God's covenant of people, right? And the final step was the emphasis on this, that this is a memorial, something that we're doing in grief, a remembrance of what God has done before us. And it's supposed to do it always, right? So this is the original Passover. It gets tweaked some by Jesus' day. I've already hinted at a few of these things. They're not putting blood on their doorposts, right? It's now pretty much a ritual, a ceremony happening in the temple. And note it has to happen in the temple now. So where it used to be you could do it at home. Now if you, like Jesus lived in Galilee, you've got to travel, which is on foot about 3 days journey, down to Jerusalem and do it there. So imagine all the people in Jerusalem during the Passover. You'd think Coast Guard is bad. Right? There's lots and lots and lots of people here. We actually have some near contemporary records to Jesus' time that says upwards of 200,000 sheep were sacrificed. And you could have one sheep per 10 people. That's 2 million people. I think this is probably a little bit exaggerated, but even if it's half, that's a lot of people. The thing that really sticks out to me is imagine, let's say it's half, 100,000 sheep that have been slaughtered. Imagine that. Imagine all of the blood. I mean, what do you do with all of this, right? We're going to come back to that point. I mean, so this is just kind of this radical thing, right? If you have friends now, or if you've had friends in the past who are Jewish and they've ever invited you over for a Seder meal, it's a very different thing from what's happening in these older time periods. The contemporary Jewish Seder meal, in which they do eat lamb and unleavened bread and herbs, they follow the Exodus account, right, is not a sacrifice, because they don't do sacrifices anymore. And what's the main reason for that? Why don't contemporary Jews do animal sacrifices? So that's actually not the reason. Though it might be a good one, but that's not why. Where are you supposed to do all the sacrifices? The temple. The temple has been destroyed. Right? It was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. If you were in the church service, Christine put up a slide of the Arch of Titus. That's actually about that. The Romans conquered it, leveled it, right? At that point, Jewish life is transformed. Everything has to change because you can't do most of your religious stuff, right? But in Jesus' day, they're still doing it this way. It's an animal sacrifice in the temple. Jews from all over the world have come to Jerusalem to do this. We see that Jesus himself came every year, right? He goes, we have the first story we have of this is when he's 12. His whole family comes, right? That's why they're there, right? So this is what's happening there, right? So I asked this question earlier. What are you going to do with all of these sheep, right? By the way, this is all going to happen in one day. Right? One day. It's the Nisan 14 in the Jewish calendar, which this week again it's a lunar calendar. It's what Easter's based on. This year it's April 15th, right? How do you do this quickly? Right? There's also some rules about how you're going to cook it. You're not supposed to boil it. Boiled lamb would be pretty awful anyway. Right? You roast it. So if you turn your handout over, I've got a picture. It didn't turn out very, very well, I'm sorry. But there's 3 sheep there being roasted. They've been skinned, right, and gutted, and they've been put by a fire. What does it kind of look like? The cross. This is actually how they did it. They basically crucified 100,000 sheep. So I got a quote there. I can read the quote. But this is from about 100 years afterwards. But there's still some Jews trying at the time to do some of this. It does die out. But you would butcher the sheep, right? And then you would put its front legs up on a bar that goes across. It was actually be put through the back, and then one on the bottom. What does this allow you to do? It allows all the blood to drain out, so it's kosher. Right? So I want to just pause there. If you're a Jew at this time, and you're of any sort of adult age, so you've gone to a couple Passovers, right? Every year you've seen 100,000 or more sheep crucified, right? You might start making a connection with Jesus, and that's how the early Christians start to talk, right? They make this connection of Jesus dies this way too, right? So, and in part because Jesus himself talks this way, right? There's some other elements that we should highlight about Jesus' own time. So again, right, the original Exodus, if we really date it strictly according to what the Bible says, it's about 1,500 years before Jesus' time. Well, modern scholars want to sort of push that back to about 1,300. That's probably when Exodus actually happened. Right? But either way, it's like over 1,000 years before. Right? Things change over 1,000 years. So I've already highlighted a few of these things, which is they're not putting blood on their doorposts and these kinds of things. The other thing is that they really come to see this as not just a mere memorial. We're not celebrating a birthday party or something like that. The idea is that you are actually spiritually participating in the actual Exodus that happened before. I mean, they almost talked about it in terms of we're traveling back in time to be with the Jews who were part of the Exodus. And there's even this idea of the Jews who are going to come after us. When they celebrate the Passover, they're with us too. So it's this idea of everybody everywhere from all time is spiritually participating in the original Exodus. Right? So that's the first kind of thing that's happening. The second is by Jesus' time, there was an idea that the Messiah or the Christ was going to come on the evening of the Passover meal. So they're already thinking that way. And they're talking for a couple hundred years before. They're beginning to talk about this. And if you actually go to a contemporary Jewish Seder meal, there will be an empty seat at the table. And that's for the Messiah because he might come. This is a night he's expected to come, right? So if we take all this together, we can kind of see, right, even how we think about the Lord's Supper now. It's something we do in remembrance of what Jesus did for us. Yet we tend to think, especially as Presbyterians, we think more is happening than just a mere memorial. We emphasize sort of a spiritual participation, right? The idea that you have to eat the lamb. This gets into some like the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church or the Lutherans who place more of an emphasis on the elements actually are the body and blood of Jesus. That's where they're getting these things from. If you have to eat the Passover meal, if Jesus tells us that the bread and the wine are his body and blood, the idea is you have to eat this. Right?
Amen.
Yep.
We were taking a class, it was the woman who wrote the book was Amy Levine, who is a scholar and teaches Bible. And
Yep.
And just thinking about this made me remember, one of the things she mentions is that it would be absolutely not possible that they would look at the wine as actually the blood of Christ because no one ever participated in any blood.
Right. So this
at
is.
all. If you
This is
Jewish,
one of the weird things that Jesus does here is, right, you have to butcher this lamb. It's got to be kosher. All the blood's supposed to be drained out, but they don't eat the blood, right?
So
but Jesus then gives you a command to basically drink the blood, at least symbolically.
Which she evidently just couldn't take that as literal. So it was.
She's also Jewish.
I know.
Right? I mean,
That's why I brought it up.
But I mean, there's a reason why there's a tension here, and actually why Christians from the very beginning have had so many arguments over how should we understand the Lord's Supper, because it's hard, right? The Jewish rules that are there are don't drink blood, you don't eat blood at all. But Jesus seems to give us this command, right? And so he's taking this the Passover, and tweaking it and transforming it into being about him. And that's probably the hardest part, is that like he does tell us, hey, drink this, it's my blood. We're going to look at some Bible verses, right? Yep.
Well, I can't think of his name right now, but it was referred to last week. But he's Aramaic, and Jesus was Aramaic. He spoke Aramaic, so he was in an Aramaic culture. And so this person, George, can't think of his name. Anyway, he's saying this is like an Aramaic idiom. Is when you have been through a long, hard fight with your buddies, it's like, this is what you say, I have given it all. I've given my blood, I've given my body, now it's time for you guys to carry on. So he's saying, in an Aramaic sense, Jesus is talking about the long fight that they've been through. He's going to leave, and now they need to carry on.
But it's symbolic.
Well, I mean, it is some symbolical we could ask. I mean, I think there's good reason to sort of at least be sympathetic to Christians who think more is happening, right? We're going to be good Presbyterians and follow Calvin. Calvin actually is quite clear that it's not merely a memorial, that it's a spiritual participation, right? That's different from sort of hardcore Catholic understanding, right? I mean, the Catholic understanding is when the priest says the words of institution, that the elements actually transform, like a transformation has happened, right? One quick way to illustrate this, the Latin word for this is my body is hoc est corpus meum. Say that really fast. What you get is hocus pocus. No, I'm dead serious. This is where the phrase hocus pocus comes from. Phrase hocus pocus comes from basically probably rural Northern European uneducated priests before the Reformation who don't actually know the Latin well enough. And what they end up saying is hocus pocus, because what happens when you say hocus pocus is one thing turns into another thing. It's actually the origins of that phrase. That's the Catholic
Say the Latin one more time.
Hoc est corpus meum.
Yes.
It's this is body homine, right?
Well, Nick, isn't that what magicians use?
Well, I mean, that's kind of the idea. Is what's happened. I mean, if you really want to, I always find this people are curious to understand how it works. So it turns on classical Greek, Aristotelian way of thinking about physics. So, what makes a thing a thing? Right? We're all human beings. What makes us human? Well, I mean, yeah, we're made up of stuff, but like, what's the essence of being human? It's actually kind of hard to figure out what that is.
Consciousness.
Because it isn't having things like two arms or brown hair, right? So those external things of me, right? I can lose my arms and I'm still a human. These external features are called accidents because they're not essential to who I am. Then there's the essence of me, which is actually really hard to get a hold of. So the Catholic understanding is the accidents of the bread and wine remain, but the essence of what they are transforms. So what you really are eating Jesus' body and drinking his blood, but the external accidents are still there of bread and wine, which is why it doesn't taste like flesh and blood. But they really do think that they've been transformed, right? That there's a physical transformation that somehow happened, right? By the way, other Christians think this too. The Lutherans think that the real body and blood of Jesus is now present with the bread and the wine. So you really are eating it, right? The Reformed tradition in which we're a part, right? The emphasis is on the spiritual. But it's not like the Baptists who think it's just, we're just remembering what Jesus did. The Reformed are actually closer to the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church. And the idea there is it's a spiritual presence. And I mean, one of the ways to think about it, it's not that the elements are being transformed, it's that we are actually being brought into God's presence. It's almost as, I mean, the way the Orthodox understand it is the gates of heaven open, and we get brought up into heaven for a little bit to be with Jesus. But he's present in a unique way. That's a whole lot like, sounds a lot like what someone like John Calvin was thinking, right? We're a little bit off topic, but I mean, this is kind of, but there's a reason why of some of the things that happen in these passages are difficult to sort of make a sense of, and there's different ways to do it. So let's turn the handout over and look at some of the New Testament passages. So, first two are from Gospels, actually giving us the account of the Lord's Supper. So, Matthew tells us, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, he blessed it, he broke it, gave it to his disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Right, and after taking a cup and giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Right? So, I mean, this is good Jewish Passover language, but moved from the lamb to Jesus' own person. Right? He's moving it. Right? But John doesn't actually give us an account of the Lord's Supper, but he gives us a very long account in John chapter 6 of Jesus arguing with some Jewish leaders, right? And Jesus talks about, "I'm the bread that has come down from heaven." That's again a reference to the Exodus and a manna in the wilderness. Jesus says, "I'm the bread of life." He goes on to say, "Your ancestors ate manna, they still died, right? But if you eat this bread, you will live forever," right? The bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh, he says. And then they ask, how is it possible for this man to give us his flesh to eat? Right? Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I tell you, if you all," it's a plural, "if you don't eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you will not have life in yourselves." Right? So again, is it a metaphor? Is it literal? Is it somewhere in between? We could argue about all that. But Jesus is clearly taking all the Passover language and reconfiguring it, transforming it to be about him. Right? I mean, we get this pretty steady theme that we should see Jesus as a kind of Passover sacrifice. Right? If we go to 1 Corinthians, which we already saw one verse from there, we get Paul again giving instructions. The context of this is, it seems like in the very, very early church, so this is probably only 30 years or so after Jesus' time, the Lord's Supper is celebrated potluck style. Everybody comes, brings their own food. Maybe you should share, but this is how it's happening. And some people have all kinds of food to eat. Some people don't have a lot. Some people are getting drunk, right? He's up the set, right? And then he gives us instructions. He says, "For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that on the night when the Lord was betrayed," there's a fun wordplay there. The word handover and the word betray is the same word. "He took a bread, and giving thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body that is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' He did the same with the cup after the supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" Right? So it's at a minimum remembrance, right? Maybe more, right? But I just think it's worth pointing out, right? This is what Jesus does, right? And we look at how he does it. He both keeps Passover things and he transforms things. So what does he keep? Well, he observes the meal on the proper day. right? There's a big dispute amongst biblical scholars how to think of the date of this, because the Matthew, Mark, and Luke clearly assign the day of the meal to the proper day, and then Jesus dies. It's actually the night before Jesus dies, right? The day after. John moves it, or seems to move it, to a day earlier, so that Jesus actually dies on the day of the Passover meal, to make it clear, hey, he's the Passover lamb. Whether there's really a discrepancy or not, is something people like to argue. But what that discrepancy tells us is they are clearly seeing Jesus as a Passover sacrifice, right? So what does Jesus do? He celebrates it on the proper day. He goes to Jerusalem to do it. He celebrates it at night. They drink wine, not unleavened bread, but then he tweaks it, right? He acts as the host and the leader. So usually all this would have to happen at the temple, and then you'd come home and eat the meal. You'd eat it with your family. That was the normal way of doing it. Jesus doesn't eat it with his family. None of these disciples are his biological family. He transforms it to, we are going to do this as this new covenant community, right? He doesn't talk about Abraham and the covenant with Abraham. He talks about a new covenant. We just looked at that, right? And then, of course, he makes it all about him, right? He says, I'm the lamb, basically. He talks about his own body and blood, right? This new Passover isn't about the Exodus. It's not in memory of the Exodus. It's in memory of what Jesus did, right? So I mean, he takes like the most important Jewish holiday, the most important religious festival, keeps it, but transforms it, right? In a way where later Christians are going to come along and see all of the Old Testament stuff as ultimately pointing to Jesus. So in Jesus' own time, it was probably understood by at least some of, what is this guy doing? He can't change everything, right? But it's exactly what he's doing. He's changing it to say those older things, they were actually all ultimately preparation for me, right? See how that works, right? So that's really what he's doing here. He's connecting all of these things. So you should it's both amazing how deeply Jewish it is. He's taking all of this sort of the essential practices of Judaism and saying, really, this has always been about me, right? And we tend to lose some of that Jewish background because we don't know it, or we're just trained to immediately read through all the Old Testament stuff and say, well, it's really about Jesus. But it actually helps to sort of understand how it was originally practiced, how it was understood in Jesus' time, and then how it's evolved, right? Questions? I'm sure there's a lot. We'll get that pretty quick.
So, I thought, and you just mentioned this under your outline, C1, Israel celebrated the Passover to remind them of their covenant with God. Jesus reconfigures it to be a covenant in and truth with all human beings. And so, this raises two questions in my mind. So, actually one was a thought, the concept of our own exodus from exodus of exclusion of people of faith in relationship to God to this new covenant, as you said, where we transform and go to this next level. And then the other part of that is with all human beings. And it strikes me, unless I'm wrong, that Judas was at this part of before he left. So when did it become not for all human beings?
Explain to me a little bit, what would you ask?
So I look at, when I was a child, I always thought, I'll be honest here, I thought communion was a drudge and was like a funeral service, And I'll never forget when minister said, my dad was a pastor, so it's not like he made it a funeral service, but that's what I thought the Calvinistic people did with it. And all of a sudden, one of our ministers in our former church said, you know, used the term, this is a celebration, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, what book was he reading? That was number one. And then number two, I felt like for 2,000 years, since the Last Supper, where Judas was sitting there, Peter was there, I could have been there, in many ways have been there, we have done nothing but exclude all from that table. And so if everybody was invited, and the new Exodus and covenant was as to all as opposed to a chosen few, where the pronouncement was, I'm remembering God or Christ because God transformed through Christ for all of us to be there. When did we decide as a church to start excluding people from the table?
I mean, the exclusion of people from the table, the understanding, I mean, again, this is going to be, different churches are going to understand it in different ways. So, St. John's, Lutheran, am I pointing the right way? That way. That way, I'm totally off. You can think of, I mean, so they're a Lutheran church in Missouri, the synod, and their practice is, our church is the right church, basically. Everyone else is wrong. So if you're going to participate in this, you got to be in the right church. So everyone's welcome, but you need to be a member. Right?
But I'm saying, even as a kid, I remember I was brought up in a Reformed church, and we didn't take communion in our own church.
Yeah.
And then the minister we had at this former church said anybody can take it, and our daughter, who was 3, martyred. I mean, all I'm saying is not just Lutherans and Catholics. I think Calvinistic Protestants have excluded people from the table, and there was no vote as to whether Judas or Peter or anybody else sitting there actually believed in what Jesus was even saying. In fact, their behavior and my behavior shows quite the opposite, and yet I can go to the table. So when did we start excluding people from the table?
So from the start, the idea was you got to come because you were part of the community, right? It's always been the way it's done. In the terms of like, let's say excluding children, practices, I mean, you can think of this in the earliest church, everybody's a convert, right? So whether you're a good convert or not, right? But this idea, everybody's a convert. As Christianity develops and Christians start having kids, there's this big question of, well, when do they become Christians, right? So it is for everybody, but the idea, I mean, so even in technically our polity, our rules say, anyone can come into our church and have communion who's baptized. That's actually our technical rule. Not all churches keep it, they kind of let everybody in. But it is our technical rule. So a Baptist or a Catholic or an Eastern Orthodox person can come to our church and participate, right? Because it's still a covenant community. Like you're agreeing to be part of this community, right? And I always think it's important to ask, like, let's say someone who's in a Hindu or in atheist comes to our church and wants to participate. My question would be, why do you want to do this? Because by doing it, you're proclaiming, as we just read, you're proclaiming that Jesus is Lord. So, I mean, I think my answer would be like, you're welcome to come. I don't know why you want to. Because by participating in it, you're actually, I mean, it's a public declaration that you're a Christian. I'm happy to have you come convert. But that's basically what they're doing.
Except none of those people made a public declaration that was consistent with what their actions.
Well, but their public declaration is they're with Jesus.
Right.
Yeah, does that make sense? I mean, the very fact that they're with him, Judas isn't with him well, right? But they've been his followers for at least 3 years. So he does this first meal, hey, you're my people. And he tells them, keep doing this because I'm going to go away now. Right? But it is tricky, like how we want to welcome people. We don't want to come. Like, I mean, it would be hard to, I mean, I go to a wedding at a Catholic church. I always find it problematic that I can't participate because I'm a Christian too, right? But their idea is, well, but you don't have it all the way correct. Come, but I mean, again, it's the same idea. They're saying, come join us. You are welcome to come join us at any point.
Wasn't this the same question about circumcision?
I mean, again, and that's one way to even think of it. I mean, that's technically how the Presbyterian tradition has often thought of baptism. What happens when you get circumcised in ancient Judaism? That makes you a Jew, makes you part of the God's covenant of people. But we think the same thing about baptism in a certain way. You get baptized, you're in, right? Yeah, I know it's time. So we need to go.
So you need to do another, we would
Yeah,
love it
we
if
could
you do
spend
a
lots of time on
follow-up
this.
class. Yeah, I mean, it would be great if we could do
Yeah.
a whole separate class just on, starting at this point,
Yeah,
going
we can do that.
forward in history to today,
Yeah.
because it's so confusing.
It is. It's absolutely confusing. Okay, well, I'll be happy to start doing that after Easter.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.